Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Infirmary, where I and my guests try to dispel and debunk myths that show up in the endurance sports world and help you be faster and happier and healthier in your training. Today, we are super lucky to have Tash Cooper-Smith join us from Precision Fuel and Hydration, which, as a bunch of you know, has been a long-term association for Campfire and the nutrition company that I am always recommending to people because there's actually enough sodium in the product to make a difference in your existence. And usually, you guys know that I have a lot of information about my guest, and this is a different case with Tash. We just met a few minutes ago. And so, Tash, can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in this chair today?
Yeah, so I am one of the sports scientists at Precision Fuel and Hydration, as you said. I've worked here for 2 years now. I have done a Bachelor of Science and then a Master's in Sports Nutrition. Fortunately enough, that was sort of enough qualifications to get me here to working with some really cool athletes. And hopefully today we can sort of go through some of the key bits that will help everyone and all of your listeners.
Another thing before we got on, you were saying that like Mondays are busy. It's like late afternoon in the UK right now, and that's where you're at. And you said that something that usually happens on Monday is you're kind of collating results of your athletes from the weekend. Tell us about some of the athletes that you work with and what that relationship looks like.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate that I get a variety of athletes. So I've got some triathletes, ultra runners, gravel cyclists, a big range. So it means that I get to see, different strategies, different ways in which I can support them as a sports scientist. Recently at the weekend, I had two female pro triathletes that were racing at Challenge Wanaka. So Beck Clark and Tamara Jewett. And it's cool because I get to chat to them ahead of their race and then I get to see how they do on the race itself. Fortunately, they both got onto the podium. So for me, that's great to see. And then we spend Monday sort of as a debrief to understand in their fuel and hydration, what do they do well? What could be done better? How can we refine it so that in their next race, they hopefully get as good results?
Nice. Yeah, and I think that, yeah, first of all, congratulations. It's always great to be racking up podia with your athletes. And so if that's what a Monday is like, what is just a general day at the office like for you? What are the things that you are expected to do as a sports scientist? I think a lot of athletes out there are kind of like, yeah, sports scientists exist. They make things, but we have no idea what they're doing. So what are some of the things that you end up doing in a week?
I think sports science is such a big term for the job that we have. Some people say that we're like sports nutritionists. Some people say we're exercise physiologists. They're all here. We do basically all of it. So no day is ever the same as another day. Sometimes I'm just sat at my desk answering emails from pro athletes or chatting to customers about their fuel and hydration or in video calls with them. Other days I'll spend the full 9 to 5 in the lab doing lactate threshold testing. We offer sort of heat experience sessions or heat acclimation sessions. So running those, we do a bit of research along the side. So collecting data, running trials in our lab. It kind of varies day to day. And I think that's what makes it really cool.
Yeah, it's like one of those jobs where you're never quite sure what's going to happen on a day, which yeah, like that's that has been the unifying feature of every job I've done too, where it's like something's going to happen today. It's going to be interesting. But what are those? So, are the lactate tests? Is the goal there some sort of like, I mean, obviously you're doing some intensity testing. Is there some metabolic testing that is part of that? Like, is that what you're doing in that particular case? Or are you more locating LT1, LT2 and kind of being like, yeah, that's good enough?
Yeah, for now, it's just LT1, LT2, or some pro athletes come to us with a protocol they want us to run on them. Some of the ones that we're working with for just general customers, it is just a set ramp test that we offer. And hopefully there'll be some metabolic testing to come, but it's sort of, we're trying to persuade the team to get hold of a metabolic cart at the moment to be able to do that because I think that, resting metabolic rate and substrate utilization and that kind of thing is, as well as just VO2 max testing, is super interesting, but it's not that accessible to everyone. So if we can make it more accessible, then maybe, but yeah, hopefully on the way.
Yeah, I bet substrate utilization would be like incredibly helpful for what you guys are trying to do.
Yeah, no, it also just says a lot about an athlete, I think. You can test someone's thresholds very easily. I mean, anyone can do it with a lactate monitor, but yeah, seeing how hard are you actually working by using carbs or fats is kind of the gold standard, I'd say. So yeah, it will come just with time.
Nice. Now, before we got on, we were talking about your history as an athlete, and you were a competitive gymnast until 2016. Shout out to the athlete I work with, who was also a gymnast. She is going to be like, "Oh my god, I feel so seen." What did you have to do? Did you do any of that metabolic testing, and what was kind of the result of that as you were shifting from a very explosive background into long distance triathlon, which you picked up in 2021?
Yeah, it was probably less structured than what maybe some people go through at the moment. I was finishing school and starting university, and the transition was just more because it was convenient to go from the level I was at in gymnastics. I didn't want to continue anymore. And yeah, I thought I'll just join the local triathlon club. And at the time, my degree helped me do some of the testing in the lab. So I never did sort of substrate utilization, but I did VO2 max testing. And I can tell you the VO2 max I had as a gymnast is considerably different to the one I have now as a triathlete. I am obviously far more aerobically fit. But I didn't utilize any of that information. I sort of just started doing more endurance training and then got a coach when I realized like, oh, this is actually going somewhere. And then changed coaches when I realized how much I wanted to progress. And it's only now where I really understand that changing training and doing certain things for different people or personalizing it is actually so important.
Tell me about the differences between a gymnast VO2 max and an endurance athlete's VO2 max, because it's not something that you would expect a gymnast to even test. Though I'm guessing like a floor routine, which does go on for like 2 minutes, right? 2 minutes, something like that. So VO2 max is important, like what, yeah, tell me a little bit about that because now I'm just curious. Now I'm like, oh, how did gymnasts use VO2 max or that idea? Maybe you didn't test effectively then, but yeah, what does that look like for a gymnast?
It was I was sort of right at the end of it where I've always been fairly fit. I've been into team sports or running around, not structured endurance training, but I could keep up with most people. And I remember going to the lab in my first year of my undergraduate degree where they were like, yeah, do you want to do this research study? And I thought, yeah, why not? Like I can sit on a bike for 2 hours. Never done it before, but I'll give it a go. And the first testing was a VO2 max test to see if you're eligible. And for women, it had to be a minimum of like 40 as a VO2 max. And I scraped it. I had like 44. So I was like, okay, great. Like to me, that sounded amazing at the time. And then as I got into the degree, I was like, oh, this is just like average. Like this is fine, but it's not actually brilliant. And then I've recently done testing and it's like 62 maybe. There's quite a considerable difference. And that's like with 4 or 5 years of triathlon. So yeah, it's, you'd hope it would change like that. But I was far stronger back then. I can't even like do a pull up and lift my body weight now, but
Yeah,
I can ride my bike for 6 hours. So it's just different sport.
totally. And, I mean, whenever somebody shifts into an endurance mode, like their VO2 max is going to go up. Like, we sort of just know that. I mean, there is this, maybe one of the myths we can get into is like that VO2 max is fixed genetically because like clearly it's not. You raised yours. I mean, like 20 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That's like that you raised it by 50%, which is nuts. Can you talk a little bit about why that change happens early for an athlete and then what happens to it over the long term?
The change is always pretty quick initially. You'll see huge performance gains in the first year, maybe up to 3 years of starting the sport. And I always refer to it as like newbie gains. You get lucky when you first start because you see this progression that's very, like goes straight up kind of linear. Whereas beyond that, it becomes a lot more stunted. You have to do a lot more to get any gain if, you're never going to achieve the same sort of scaled progression. But I think it just comes from the fact that when you start off and you are so much less fit, there is more room to get fit than when you're already a very fit athlete. To become more fit, there's less sort of margin to push it up. And as you get more and more conditioned, it has to become more specific. And I think people forget that the specifics and the overload and the things that you do needs to become very refined, and that's where getting a coach, like yourself, or seeking out some more support is where you actually make more gains. Whereas a beginner could just start doing triathlon training on their own and probably get quite far up until a certain point.
Where did you discover that leveling off? Where did that happen, and what was that like for you?
I'll say something crazy. I don't think it has leveled off just yet. I don't know. I think my got quite fit quite fast just from being consistent. And then when I changed coach, I basically saw like a got fit really quick. It started to level, got a new coach, got fit incredibly quick. And then I was like, oh, wow, it's still going up. And I now see it, continuously. I do a couple of months block and I'm way further ahead than I was, anytime before, whether that's because I have the tools around me to better myself or, it is just consistency. I have to do a lot more specific training, but yeah, I hope there's more progression to be made.
Yeah, I mean, if you're sitting in the low to mid 60s, by this point with this, only a few years of training, and it's still going up, like there's a lot there. That's a pretty big engine, everybody. Like 62, and like it's one of those spaces where you're like, okay, you're starting to scratch the edge of that like elite amateur, like you're hitting that dividing line between like high end amateur and then like pro. And something Tash isn't telling you guys ever, telling all of you is that did her first Ironman last summer, went sub 10 in her first Ironman, qualified for Kona on the first crack, went to Kona, and then approached it exactly the way I think everyone should their first time at Kona is like, just soak it up. Like, it's such a different race. It's so hard. It's just like the conditions are nuts. The stress is high. The logistics are difficult. Like, everything about Kona is hard. So, you know, two Ironmans in what, 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, it was quite a lot. I
Yeah.
wouldn't do it again like that.
Yeah, and we can chat a little bit about like what recovery was like and also what was ideal, but what draws you to this kind of work in the first place? Like why sports science? Why and then eventually why like this nutrition focus?
Yeah, it's so hard to pinpoint. I think when I was a lot younger and I was having to decide what I wanted to do at university or if I even wanted to go, and I kind of thought, oh, I'll do medicine. Like, I want to be a doctor. I want to work in a hospital. I really loved the human body, and I was quite fascinated on diseases and making people better and that kind of concept. Then I actually just started talking to some people who worked in sports medicine just because of all of my hobbies, and I became more fascinated about that. And I thought, oh, if there's a way that I could help sports people in a somewhat medical setting or a clinical setting, then that could be quite cool. And that's sort of where the whole sports science came into it because I thought this is the easiest way in, understand physiology and nutrition and that kind of thing. And as I was doing those modules in my degree, I thought like, wow, nutrition is it's growing so fast. There's so much to learn. And there's also so much changing that the second you've learned it, something else has happened. And I quite like that fast paced environment. I don't like sitting still. I don't like ever feeling that I know everything because I don't think anyone ever knows everything. I feel like it's always changing. And yeah, when I then sort of dipped my toe in triathlon, I started to use some nutrition products and I started to see how performance changed with better fueling, better hydration. And it kind of brought me to precision. And I guess it's always still interested me. And I think the part I love most about the job is just research. Like you can look at so many different things and people are still missing out on things that, I'm sure there are easy research studies to do that would say a lot. And I get to work with athletes that essentially tell me those answers for myself. They tell me things that they've done that didn't go quite well or other things they've tried and they're like, this is so good. So yeah, it's been a weird way in, but it's been really cool.
Yeah, it sounds like a really like organic way in. You sort of followed the things that you were interested in and lo and behold, here you are with a job that you like doing a sport that sounds like you're really into it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's worked out. I'm pretty happy.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, tell me a little bit. So you start triathlon 2021 and then 4 years later you qualify for Kona. That is an improvement curve that a lot of people would be pretty ecstatic about. And it is basically the thing that I hear a lot of athletes say when they come and want to work with me. They're like, I want to go to Kona. And the next thing they say is like, I want to do it this year. And I'm like, ooh, okay. Um, you took like a pretty deliberate approach to it, and it sounds like it sort of presented itself to you as you kind of went through the distances and added some middle distance stuff. Can you just talk a little bit about your journey from starting to qualifying and some of the things that you learned along the way? And then what you thought, what you think made qualifying possible?
Yeah, I don't think I ever started wanting to do an Ironman. I didn't really know what they were. I kind of heard of the phrase, I'd heard of the brand. I didn't really understand the concept, and I kind of thought, yeah, that's too much. That's kind of unnecessary. So I did I did the shorter stuff. I did like sprints, I did some duathlon, I then did some standards, all with like my university team. So it was organized, it was fun. It was never that, never that competitive. Then I did my first 70.3 kind of because my friends were doing it. And I was like, oh, this seems like a cool challenge. And so I turned up on my road bike with lots of secondhand kit. And I was like, oh, yeah, this would be good. And I did quite well. I managed to get on the podium for my age group. And I was like, oh, okay. And that's when my first coach said to me, you could be quite good if you tried a bit harder. I was sort of getting by with the training. It was like, oh, I don't really fancy running today. I fancy riding. So I'll just do that. It was never that structured. And it was when the whole nutrition thing started to become a bit more relevant. I got by on my first 70.3 with very little nutrition and very little hydration. I would never recommend it to anyone, but I think adrenaline just carried me the whole way because the 2 gels I had certainly didn't go that far. But yeah, that's when I got the job at Precision. And it was sort of like, if you're going to talk to other people about it, you should probably start doing it yourself. And the biggest learning for myself was gut training. I used to really struggle. I'd have a gel and I'd just be like, I have to find the bathroom. Like I can't do a long run on gels, and I do all of my training pretty much on either real food because I thought it was easier, or I'd just not fuel. And obviously, there's some huge detriments to performance there. So I did like a 10-week structured gut training block. Essentially, anything I did, I had a gel. If I went for a 30-minute jog, I'll have a gel. If I did a 2-hour ride, I'd have several. And it got to the point where it became less uncomfortable and a bit more tolerable. I built my way up to, in the Ironman last year, I don't know the specific numbers, but it was above 90 grams an hour. It was like 100 and something on the bike and around 90 on the run. And I could have had more. I personally don't think everyone needs to go much further beyond that. But the practice and the progression in the fueling was probably the biggest thing I've learned. I guess it's always something, if you do it wrong, you probably are going to change. And for me, I had a couple of races where I didn't fuel properly, and I felt the effects of that. And it taught me, learn, do better. And it was, it paid off, as you said, got to Kona. So that was a good result. I didn't want to go to Kona until I learned what Kona was. And I spoke to my athletes and they said to me like, oh, you should give it a go. My partner, he's also a sports scientist here. And he said to me like, I've been, surely you're going to go. And it became sort of like okay, you should probably think about going and doing an Ironman.
Mm.
Yeah. So it was maybe a bit of peer pressure, but it paid off.
Did you enjoy it? Like, did you enjoy your first Ironman? Did you enjoy your Kona?
First Ironman was like honestly one of the best days of my life, best and worst, because there were points in that race that I mean, this is just an example, but I personally suffer really badly from migraines, and I get them from loads of different reasons, whether it's blood sugar or wind or stress, like loads of different things trigger it for me. And on the day itself, I don't know what happened, but I started to feel it, and I was like, okay, so you're going to have to sit on the side of the road for a bit, wait for it to come, sort of clear itself. And I did that. And that was really hard mentally because I thought, oh God, my race is over. I'm only halfway into the bike and I'm going super well. And that was the key thing. I was almost going too well, but I got myself together, got through, and I got to the run. And I just remember seeing people around me and hearing the whole, like, you're doing really well. I've heard a few times, like, you're sort of in the top 5 women on the day. And I was like, okay, cool. Didn't expect that. And I just loved, in a weird way, I loved the pain. I loved
Mhm.
knowing that, like, okay, it's hard, but you're doing everything right. Like the day for me was one of the best days. It couldn't have gone better in terms of like fueling, the carb load the day before, my bike, didn't have any issues. I got pretty lucky. Yeah, it was incredible. But obviously it's such a battle because every part of you is like, I'm so tired. So yeah, it was good. And Kona, I guess, was I like to reframe things a little bit when I got to the point I was like, oh, maybe I could do really well in Kona because I did really well in my first. And as it got closer and closer, and I realized my body was sort of still recovering from the first. And when you go into a session, your heart rate's sort of not where it should be. And I thought, okay, Kona is an incredible place, an incredible experience. If I get to the start line and I get to the finish and I've had a day, that's enough for me. And as most people find in Kona, there's a lot of challenges, and I came across a lot of them. And I just thought, do you know what? Like, I looked around, I was like, how often can you say to someone you've raced in Hawaii? So I was very grateful for that experience.
Nice. Can you tell us a little bit about what that 10-week gut training program is like?
Yeah, it started off pretty awful, I can't lie. And it's one of those things I tell my athletes. I say to them, like, it's not pleasant, but then a lot of triathlon isn't pleasant. You do it because you love it, but there are sides of it that aren't so glamorous. And for me, it was like, and I'll be completely honest with you, I was planning routes that sort of like circle my house in case I needed the bathroom. But it meant that I would stick to my fueling because it was like, okay, fine. Like, if it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be uncomfortable. And I'd be strategic. I'd do my runs in the morning when I hadn't eaten too much, but I was able to fuel a bit harder. I basically started at every session of any kind, had 30 grams an hour. And then once I'd done that for 2 to 3 weeks, I sort of said, okay, I'll do 45, which is like a gel and a half if you're using precision. Did that for again, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. It got super comfortable. I was like, this is fine. I'm getting hungry. Like, I can tolerate more. Got to 60, basically did the same and worked all the way up to 90. And then I got to the point where I was like, okay, I'm at 90. There is potential that I could have more. So I just toyed with having like 100, 120 during key quality sessions, race pace bikes, anytime that your session simulated the race itself. So if I was running fast, I'd do it when my body was under stress, and I'd try and go up to 100, 120 grams of carb an hour. And yeah, it did get to the point where it was like, I don't even notice I'm doing it. It's become a habit. And I do like to remind people of that it may start uncomfortably, but your body just needs to learn. And if you don't teach it and you don't put it under stress, it can't adapt to that stress. It's the same way you wouldn't tell someone to ride their FTP for 2 hours because it's not physically possible. But if you do lots of small sessions of 10 minutes or 5 minute blocks, you gradually build your FTP, you gradually increase the power so that you could probably have done that previous power for 2 hours. It's the same like building up tolerance, but you just have to be disciplined, and it's quite boring, but it works.
When did the stomach issues, when did you stop having to plan routes that went by your house?
I can't say I even remember, but I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks in. It was sort of just, okay, I'm having a gel. Like, I might have finished the run and felt like my stomach was a bit crampy or uncomfortable, but it was, the first 2 weeks were the worst. And it was just because I went from having nothing, like not even drinking fluid during a run, to then putting in processed sports nutrition, which is very unfamiliar, but your body learns pretty quick. So
And there is a chunk of the population for whom fructose like doesn't work. And I'd be curious to know from your perspective, do you think that the actual percentage is lower and people just aren't pushing through that like 2 or 3 weeks of where they're really committed to a sports nutrition product? Because sure, there are products out there that use dextrose or something else or just sucrose or whatnot. But we know at this point in like sports science world that like a fructose and another sugar is usually better. So for the fructose resistant people out there, whether it's real or whether they just haven't kind of like done the work yet, like what would you suggest to those people?
I think it's tricky. I don't actually come across it very often anymore, even in the everyday athletes, the non-professionals, the amateurs that I speak with. No one ever brings up fructose as is this the reason I'm having stomach issues? And unless you've gone to a medical professional who's told you you have an allergy or you have an intolerance to it, I'd probably just say like, either the ratio of your sports nutrition product is incorrect or you're having too much fructose in one go. There is some logic that our fructose transporters in the body cap out at maybe 30 grams an hour. But there's now sports nutrition products being made in a 1-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio, which basically suggests that no, there's room to push what you're having. So I say the first thing I'd do is I'd look at what's actually the ratio in your product. Is it 2-to-1 glucose to fructose? Is it 1-to-1? Is it 1 to 0.8? what is it, and go for the least aggressive first. So in this instance, I'd say 2 to 1, which is most brands at the moment. There are some that are being a bit more specific, but most, and Precision is one of them, is a 2 to 1. And I'd start there. I think people forget that fructose is in a lot of real foods that we eat. And if you're able to eat them, then you're probably able to eat the gels. It's just either you're having too many in one go, so you're actually trying to push your body beyond what it's trained to do, or maybe you just need to lower the amount of fructose within that. Uh, yeah, it's a sort of step by step process that I encourage. But I don't, as I said, unless there's an intolerance or an allergy, I normally just politely ignore the person and tell them to try again.
I love that. You're a born coach. You're like, okay, great. I see that. Let's try it anyway. You also brought up, an always hot topic with athletes of carb loading, and what does it look like for you? I mean, again, carb loading is probably somewhat personal, but then we also know that there's probably some best practices for everybody. What does it look like for you, and what would you suggest for like an athlete that you've just started working with, so you don't really know them?
Yeah, it's funny you say that actually. I recently had a question from one of my friends. They said, how do you get around this? I'm doing a marathon. I think he said to me he weighs about 80 kilos and he has no idea how he's going to get 800 to 900 grams of carbs in. And I said, what are you actually eating? And it was very easy for me to identify the things that are taking up space in his stomach that don't need to be there. So when I think about a carb load for myself or for anyone else, I say, you don't really need any fiber. So vegetables, like wholemeal foods, probably just remove them for a day. And the first question is like, oh, that's not healthy. I'm like, yeah, but it's 1 day in your life, it's only one small step. So once you've gotten out of that, I say, okay, look at fat. So lots of people like to include nut butters or nuts or seeds because they're healthy, or like avocados and oils. And I'm like, okay, day before a race, we don't really need them. So let's get rid of them. And then I sort of get onto the protein and I say, protein is good and it's very satiating. So the day before a race, you don't want to feel hungry the whole day. So some protein is maybe needed, whether it comes from like lean meats or eggs or, like some dairy is fine. But I try to keep it a complete minimum because I know that it's just going to take up space in my stomach that could actually go to carbohydrates. So then when it gets to carbs, I say, what are the things that are most easy to digest? More often than not, they are things like rice, or sweets, or sports nutrition products, because they are there for a reason. They've been developed to be absorbed very quickly. And the goal is get something that gets broken down, digested, absorbed into your bloodstream, and sort of taken up by the muscles as fast as possible. So for me, it's very dull. I have a menu that I rinse and repeat. I have rice. I have a bowl of rice 4 times a day for the day before my race. I change it slightly so that I think twice I have it with banana and like jam or honey or like some sort of syrup to just make like a sweet meal. And then I treat myself later on to a bit more savory and I have either chicken or eggs of some kind just to make myself a bit more full. And then around that, I actually just eat sweets. I pick Haribos usually just because they're very easy to get in. I enjoy them. And that's the key thing I say to people. The foods you eat, if you can enjoy them, you'll be able to do it better. But for me, I try and aim for anywhere from, I don't know, 600 to 800 grams, which is like 12 to 13 grams per kilo. And I don't find it very challenging. I used to, but I found the challenge more, oh, but I would rather eat this, not I can't do it. It was just, I'd rather have toast and peanut butter and nice foods and things that I actually enjoy. I didn't want to eat rice 4 times a day, but it works. Yeah, it's convenient.
Have you seen the Peter Sagan video, the no Haribos are safe around Peter Sagan?
I have, and it's so good. My old professor that I worked with when I was at uni, he did the same. He was like, I will just prescribe Haribos in someone's nutrition plan before a race. I'm like, that's brilliant. It works.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you're like, "Oh, these are basically sports gummies, these are excellent." And, you can always do better in terms of sodium and stuff, but it's just like a steady carbohydrate thing the day before a race. Yeah, it is brilliant. So, during your introduction, and we're sort of getting to this a little bit, but, you had also said that you work with a gravel team. You work not just with triathletes. What are some of the differences in sports nutrition between the different sports out there?
I think the biggest one is the way that the athletes have to carry their fuel. In triathlon, it's almost quite convenient that you have somewhere for your bottles to go on your bike. And that's similar in obviously in gravel cycling. But the things they choose, so triathletes have flow gel, for example. That's something we have developed for triathletes and for ultra runners because you can put it into soft flask and you can hold it like a flask of water, but it's actually full of gel. In cycling, they have to consider, just as we go to an aid station and grab whatever's on course, they've got to go to crude pit stops or aid station where they get more bottles. I actually try and approach it very similarly. I try not to say you're a different athlete, so you should have a different plan, but I try and look at their individual needs for carb, fluid, sodium, and how that they physically can carry it and how they choose to. One of the female riders of the gravel team I work with, she likes to have chews or she likes to have some solid food because she, unlike some people, can actually digest it and tolerate it very well under high intensities, whereas some of her other teammates, they prefer to just drink it. And I actually just listen more to the individual than, oh, you're a cyclist, you should do this, because everyone's sort of different.
Are there differences in the amounts? And this is probably because, like running is a little harder, there's a lot of bouncing, there's a lot of shaking, cross country skiing, your poles are literally attached to your hands. It makes drinking a little harder or eating. Um, but is it easier for a cyclist to get in, 120, 130, 150 grams versus a triathlete?
I think it's easier on the bike portion to fuel. For triathletes, you could actually just have more on the bike. And we often see that where it's front loaded and they have less on the run. I think one of the things we forget for cyclists is they do multi day or they do stage races where they're racing the subsequent day. And for them, it's not just, I'm not just thinking about what I need for the Saturday race. I'm also thinking if I fuel a bit harder and I can tolerate it, I'll probably recover better for Sunday's race. And I think that's where some of the differences lie, that they tend to actually overfuel, not because they're going to use it on the day, but that their muscles will use it throughout the evening and into their sleep and their recovery. And they'll start with higher glycogen levels than someone who maybe had less carbohydrates during.
This kind of goes right into one of my big questions for anybody that I have on. And that's basically like, what are the misconceptions about your area of expertise that you bump into the most? And so in this case, I'd say like, what are the misconceptions you hear about carbohydrate consumption and sodium? Because I think those are two things that, you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. And so what are the misconceptions about those two things that you bump into the most?
There are so many. People love to tell me things they are so certain about. And I hate to say that they're wrong, but I think one of the biggest ones at the moment is in carbs is just that more is better. A lot of people think that because the professionals are able to tolerate 120, 130, 150 grams of carbs an hour, that the everyday amateur or the elite amateur can actually do the same. Not many of us can. The pros, they can tolerate it because they do it every single day. They're used to these products. I think it lies with what I said earlier about they just have more training to do the next day or they have another race the next week, that they actually just think this is more suitable for my situation. And I don't think many of us are able to actually digest and oxidize more than 110, 120 grams per hour. And there's a lot of research coming out into it at the moment that in some situations, slightly lower is absolutely fine. You don't need to be topping out above 100 every time. And different athletes need to be listened to for their own needs. Someone who weighs 50 kilos is probably going to need a different amount to someone who weighs 80 or 90. And the literature isn't quite there yet. There's not enough research in it, but there are clear trends that small female athletes are having less. And it's not just because of convenience or misconceptions that, women are smaller, so must need it. But there's got to be something in that they have less muscle mass. They're probably working at a lower relative absolute intensity. Sorry. They might be working just as hard for themselves, but a guy pushing 300 watts is not the same as a girl pushing 150 watts. The energy expenditure is very different. So when people say, oh, I'll just keep having more, I try and reframe it to like, why do you think you need more? I suppose that sort of leads on to some people say, I don't need to fuel, it's only a 2 hour ride. And you've got like the other extreme there where it's everyone's saying more is better. And then some people are saying, if it's only a couple of hours, I probably don't need it. And I always try and zoom out and say, like, okay, but what's tomorrow? What are you fueling for? They are the two most common misconceptions I come across.
Yeah. And how do you determine replenishment rate? Both for this, I would say like carbohydrates, fluid, and sodium. Like, what do you start at a certain, like, okay, most people are here, and then we try to figure out this individual athlete. But, for somebody who is totally brand new to this and is like, okay, I have to replenish these three things, how much should I, like, what would you do with somebody who is encountering that for the first time?
I think for during exercise, the first way I start is I say the general recommendation, so where the research actually lies. And for carbs, it's between 60 to 90 grams an hour for most of us is sufficient. And I'd always then say, like, start at the lower end, start maybe just below that, see how you get on. If it's too much at the time, lower it, practice it, respond to it, and then just work your way up really gradually to 80 to 90 grams an hour, and then just settle, make that comfortable. With fluid, I always say to people, if they've got access to, bathroom scales and they can weigh themselves, that is the easiest way to work out how much you should actually be having. Go and sit on your turbo for an hour, weigh yourself before and after, work out the fluid loss by weighing yourself. And then from that, you can sort of interpret how much fluid you need. And you don't need 100% replacement in the session. Afterwards, you want to be aware of how much you've lost so that you can continue drinking throughout the day so you don't end up dehydrated. But, if someone said to me they lost a litre, which is a kilo on the scales, I'd say, okay, during that session, consider drinking 500 to 750 mil, and then just continue to stay hydrated. If that is an accessible and easy means for someone, I'd say do it over lots of sessions. Do it on a hard bike, an easy bike, an outdoor run, an indoor run, and then learn. In these conditions, this is my sweat rate. In those conditions, it's slightly less. Sodium is the trickiest. I work for a company that have a sweat test machine. You can come and sit for half an hour and chat to me and get your sweat sodium tested, and you don't have to do any exercise. And that in itself is a really, really great way because we actually get to talk to the athlete and try and discuss their fueling strategy there and then, whilst also learning their sweat sodium concentration. That's not accessible to everyone. It costs money. We also have test centers dotted around, but it may not be convenient. So the next thing I say to them is, okay, well, the average that we've seen across many thousands of people is about 950, 990 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid. And in that, I then say, if you're unsure and you have no idea, you don't even know if you cramp, you don't know about, can you ever taste salt? Have you ever seen salt stains on your kit? So like white marks on a black top. I'd say aim for the average. Aim for about 1,000 milligrams per liter of fluid and refine based on how you feel. If you're still suffering from muscle cramps and you lose a lot of fluid based on the sweat rate test, maybe have a little bit more sodium. If you actually find that you're completely fine and a bit less, okay, maybe that works for you. But I try and, with all of this, I think it's trial and error. I don't think you're ever going to get it right first time. I don't think you're going to get it right second time. I think it's going to take a lot of testing different products, different strategies. But it is easy once you understand it. And speaking to someone normally helps, whether that's a coach, a nutritionist. Yeah, that's what I think.
And for everybody out there, I have taken one of these precision hydration sweat the sodium content tests, and it's great. It's really helpful. I ended up at 1,100 milligrams per liter, so like slightly above average. But then another athlete that I work with went and did it as well, and he was 1,700 per, and I was like, oh my goodness, okay. I was like, we might have to rethink long distance stuff. And should an athlete aim for 100% of sodium replenishment as well? Or is it like the fluid sort of like start at 50 to 75%?
I always avoid calculating sodium intake as an absolute thing. I say try and get the per amount of fluid right. And if, for you, if it's roughly 1,000 milligrams per liter of fluid and you're doing that in nearly all the drinks you're having during a race, after that, just, even if it's after training, I say like, have a bit of salt on your food if you feel like you might want it. There's no point sort of measuring it out to the gram to work out what you've got. And respond to what your body wants. People often crave salty foods, and that's a good indication of maybe you need a bit more sodium, or other people actually crave plain water, which is a good indication that you've actually overdone the sodium slightly, and just to dial it back. It's the easiest way, I think.
Speaking of cramping, this is one of the questions that I encounter the most, and I'm sure you do too. And I know you work for a hydration and nutrition company, so your answers are going to be inclusive of that. But could you talk a little bit about what we know about cramps in terms of the science and the different factors that go into a cramp?
Yeah, I think we know it's very multifactorial. It could be electrolyte imbalance, which is, what you're suggesting by the association to my company. It could also be fluid loss, which in turn affects electrolyte imbalance. And, you mentioned your sweat sodium concentration and you mentioned your friends. But the one thing people forget is that if you actually have a higher sweat rate and you lose more fluid, you might be very close to how much your losses are as that individual. So it's trying to get both of those parts into the equation. There's also just general fatigue, whether that's central nervous system or local muscular fatigue, that will influence it, and it influences the way your muscles contract. And in turn, essentially, a cramp is basically uh, a contraction that won't release. And it's why people often stretch out their calf, because forced load from stretching is what releases it. It encourages your muscles to stop cramping. Caffeine also plays a role. And I think, people forget that anything you put into your body is probably going to do things to your body. So if you don't have an understanding of how it affects it, it's probably a good place to start. Another one, which is always quite tricky, is lack of conditioning. And it relates to fatigue, because your muscles tend to fatigue a bit quicker. But if you're not used to that discipline, so if you're just getting into triathlon, you're not used to running and you start running, you might experience muscle cramps just purely because you're not accustomed to doing so. And you need to, maybe go to the gym a little bit and strengthen the muscles that you're about to use to get them more conditioned to cope under resistance and not fatigue as quickly. Um, it's tricky, because I think all of those things play, honestly, a pretty equal role, as much as the electrolytes and sodium does in some individuals because of their sodium loss. And your friend is one of them, losing 1,700 milligrams per liter. They are far more prone to cramping than, I lose 700, so it's
Oh
very
my
different.
gosh, you won the lottery.
Yeah.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
that's incredible. Yeah, one of my other athletes loses 800, and I was like, "Oh, you are uniquely suited for long distance triathlon."
Yeah, but with cramping, I always say, instead of trying to think what is it, try and work out what it isn't. So if you're getting your hydration strategy pretty much bang on, you've dialed it in, it's not that. Are you conditioned enough for what you're doing? Have you been doing enough fast paced work in the pool? Is that why your feet start cramping? Have you just recently introduced caffeine into your strategy? Is that now when the cramping is occurring? And I always say to people, like, work out what it isn't, and then see what you're left with, and then try and test that out again. Um, yeah, more often than not, it's far more straightforward. It's, yeah, the biggest one I come across is just that person's not accustomed enough to the sport. And triathlon and Ironman has three different sports, and if you're not well trained in all of them, you're probably going to suffer from cramping a bit more.
The fatigue and conditioning thing is always such an interesting one, because you're like, okay, where is this fatigue coming from? Is it coming from a lack of conditioning? A lot of the times I see athletes who get tired because they pace incorrectly. Like, it's so fun to ride your bike fast, but like that's not the point of a triathlon. Triathlon is like this whole thing. Do you bump into people who have paced the bike incorrectly, but they've nailed their hydration and sodium replenishment, and they end up cramping because of that? Is something that you've also seen?
Yeah, and that's usually, honestly, part of the glycogen depletion issue. So one of the things I didn't mention was carbohydrates, and you've basically explained it there by, if you're overpacing something, going too hard, you're probably just depleting your muscles at a faster rate than you're replenishing them. So even if you're getting your hydration right, you are working at harder intensity. You might be sweating even more than you expected. So even that, your carbs and your hydration might not be sort of on par with what you're doing. And then you're just exhausted, and your muscles are like trying to contract, trying to, fire the different impulses, and they can't.
What opportunity did Precision see in this space? Like, because for the longest time, the most you could probably get is a product that if you maxed out the carbohydrate from the number of scoops that you're putting in there, maybe you're getting 600 or 700 milligrams in, a liter or something like that. Precision is very salty. Like you can, if you want, put 1500 milligrams in a bottle, with the pH 1500. I know that the company, preceded your time there, but like why are the sodium numbers so high?
So the founder, Andy Blow, he was a former professional triathlete. He was out in a very hot race. He was in Kona and he suffered pretty badly from having water and the on course electrolyte drinks that were available. He had no idea about any of this kind of sweat sodium stuff. He just knew that I just have to drink during the race. And unfortunately for him, he has an incredibly high sweat sodium concentration. So he's losing a lot of sodium. He also has an incredibly high sweat rate because of how fit he was and how efficient he was at cooling down. It meant he was losing a lot of fluid. So as he was, putting away a lot of water into his body and drinking, he was actually just in turn, A, not replenishing his sodium, and B, flushing out any sodium there was from his cells. So he gave himself what we call hyponatremia, which is super low blood sodium levels. When he went to hospital, he actually had a test for cystic fibrosis, which is now known as the sweat test that we do. They got it patented to use in a professional setting in a business, and it determines obviously the sweat sodium concentration. From that, he thought, okay, what's the easiest way to look at different types of people? And he thought t-shirt sizes, so like small, medium, large. And it's kind of where we get the 500, 1000, and 1500 milligrams per liter. In general, most people will come under one of them. If you're 650, you're probably going to stick to the 500s, maybe swap in between the thousands. If you're somewhere at 1800, you're going to definitely use the 1500s, and sometimes you'll over concentrate them to account for how much you're losing. In turn, most people fall within the spectrum that we have. So we started as Precision Hydration. We were just an electrolyte or a hydration supplement company. And then during COVID in 2020, we were getting a lot of questions about, okay, what's next though? So if I've got my hydration right, what do I do about my carbs? And it became sort of natural to introduce carbohydrates to our product. And everything with the precision products is very straightforward. It says what it is on the packaging and it is in a very easy to calculate term. With carbs, the gels are 30 grams per gel, how many you need to hit the recommendations, which we say are 60 to 90 per hour. So it keeps it super simple. The same with the electrolytes. If you fall into one of these t-shirt sizes, you know that one of these tablets per bottle or however it is you're choosing to replenish yours is fairly straightforward. And it seems to be successful. The fact that we're kind of towing the line of personalization. And it's what we really want to do at the company, listen to the individual instead of just a one product fits all person.
Love that. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but again, we were talking at the top, you talked about the lab where you work has, some lactate testing, some VO2 max testing, and some heat acclimation stuff. And that is as the planet continues to warm up and there are fewer and fewer kind of temperate races out there, heat acclimation is something I hear about all the time. And so what is the protocol that you guys use and in terms of helping people do heat acclimation?
Yeah, we offer it as a couple of different scenarios. So we say to some customers, come and have an experience, a one heat session. It's about 60 minutes long. The protocol is the same for all of our heat sessions where we say you can either ride or you can either run. The lab is set to about 40 degrees and somewhere between 20 and 40% humidity. So it's pretty uncomfortable, but it gets your core temperature hot enough. We do a small 5 to 6 minute ramp from whatever is easy to about FTP. So we try and ask people of their FTP, or in running, we say, what's your fastest 5K? And we try and interpret the time from that. Once you've ramped up there, your body is hopefully pretty warm and it's starting to get hot to get to the point at which heat acclimation starts, which is about 38.5 degrees C, core body temperature. We then just ask them to ride or run at a pace we determine or a power we determine. So we say we're going to cap you at about 75% of your max heart rate. And we have them all with chest straps and we use core body temperature devices just to make sure we're monitoring them. And normally what we see is a bit of a decoupling of power and heart rate so
I
that
bet.
when
Yeah.
heart rate starts to go up, we have to decrease their power to just keep it the same, or decrease their pace. And more often than not, in those conditions, some people are actually walking instead of running because it's so strenuous. Their heart rate is so high. So we either offer it as that one day, come and experience it, or we have 5 days or 10 days. And the 10 days is the ideal time for a block of heat acclimation where you come in every single day, maybe have one day off in the middle to recover and replenish everything. But it seems to work. And it's it's a quicker form of heat acclimation than it is to do passively. So some people could go and do some sauna, post training sessions. They do their run, they get in the sauna for half an hour, or they might do the hot water immersion. So getting in a bath. But the easiest way is to actually just do it in the heat, but it's not that accessible.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so you're using that sort of isothermic method where you like ramp up the power and the core temperature comes up fast, but then you level it off. So you're not asking people to ride at FTP or 5K pace. And for those of you who don't speak C's out there, 40 C's is hot. We're talking at least 100 Fahrenheit and maybe 105. Like it's a warm room. What's the mechanism that we're after when we're doing heat training? Like what's the mechanism of the adaptation, and then what's the adaptation?
So by getting your core body temperature hot, you're essentially encouraging more blood flow. The first thing I always say to people is you're increasing training stress. So you're actually creating a stimulus that you have to adapt from. But beyond that, it's kind of like the poor man's altitude. You're getting some of this red blood cell plasma increase that you'd see if you went and did some altitude training, just hopefully a bit more accessible. And people can do this by sitting in their garage with a fan pointed slightly away from them with more clothes on. But the key thing is to get hot, not too hot, but hot enough to see this sort of benefit. Unfortunately, though, it does disappear quite quickly if you don't maintain it. I had to do some ahead of Kona, and it was super helpful. But I did it 6 weeks out, and then for the following 4 weeks, I did a couple of sessions every single week just to maintain some form of stimulus, because heat decay is a thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't just stay with you forever.
Yeah, our bodies have a way of returning to equilibrium and being like, oh, we
Yes.
don't need all this extra, like this plasma and these extra red blood cells are expensive. They're energetically expensive, and if we don't need them, our body is like, sweet, let's get rid of that. And there's the mechanism of losing your training adaptations, everyone. But I think what I want people to hear with that is that the maintenance is actually pretty easy. Like once you do the block, like you don't have to be in, this isn't something that you want to do forever. And just like altitude, if you do stay at altitude, eventually you can't do the fast training that you need to do because, the partial pressure is too low. So you can't get the stress that you want. So, okay, last question. If you could broadcast a message to everyone in the endurance world and that they would take your advice, what would that advice be?
It's a really good question. I'll give two kind of snippets. One is enjoy the process, because I think with all of this, whether it's nutritional training, and I'm sure you kind of have the same attitude, it's just enjoy the small bits, the small gains that you make every single day instead of just the outcome. So don't look at Kona that's in 2 years' time. Look at tomorrow's bike session and what you can get out of that. I think people progress far better when you take the small things instead of just looking for the end result. And I think the other thing is think about yourself, be selfish within the sport, and think everything should be personalized to you. Don't copy what someone else does. Don't think that just because your friend is doing it, you can do it. Unfortunately, we're all very different and we work differently. So work with your coach, work with your team to find something that works for you.
Love that. Yeah, I love that you've gone to two answers that are not directly linked to hydration and nutrition. That's awesome. Well, can you tell us a little bit about where people can get in contact with PH, and then also where can people follow you in your athletic endeavors?
Yep, the pH one is super simple. Precision Hydration or pfandh.com should get you there. And our Instagram is usually pretty entertaining. If you want to look at Precision FNH, that's super cool one to. We always have wacky and weird things going on there. And myself, I'm also on Instagram at tash.cs. Yeah, feel free to, reach out to me if you ever want to chat through any of this. And we do offer free video calls to any customer that wants to for 20 minutes. And that's on our website at Precision. So yeah, get on over there.
Yeah, I really encourage people to take advantage of those resources. Tash had talked about the sweat rate test, and they have a great spreadsheet that you can download for free, and it's really clear, and you can figure out your at least your sweat rate test by yourself really simply. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I like working with you guys is you have like effective, simple, and accessible solutions to these problems that are really confusing, and there's a lot of noise out there. And that's one of the reasons why I like working with PH. So thank you for this. This was awesome. I think people are going to really love this. And yeah, thanks to PH and to Precision Fuel and Hydration for supporting Campfire and also just doing really good work out there. So I really appreciate you and I appreciate the company. Thanks so much for coming to the infirmary and helping people be better.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always fun talking about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I can tell. Well, have a great rest of your Monday. I hope this is the last thing you had to do for work today, and we'll catch up soon.
Cool. Thanks very much. Have a good day.